So if I'm going to make a video talking about updating all of my emulators on the Steam Deck and getting all of my ROMs organized, it stands to reason I should probably do a follow-up talking about the games I'm actually playing and enjoying after spending about a week trying to get everything up and running perfectly and tweaked to my liking. Because here's the thing, if you had told 6-year-old me that one day I would be able to have literally every Nintendo game or Super Nintendo game that was ever made and have it all on a device like this, it would have absolutely blown my mind. But that does kind of open up a new problem, right? I mean, on the one hand, it is amazing that you can have thousands and thousands of old console and portable games at your disposal at any given moment, but then, where do you actually start? Is it possible entire generations of games might not even be worth exploring today? Does everything past hold up to present-day scrutiny, or does it fall apart once the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia come off? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that I love playing old games and talking about them, so that's what I thought I would do today, is basically explore 5 different titles across 5 different retro systems, and really just, revisit some old classics, or maybe try out some things that were entirely new and talk about what my experience was like with those. So let's go ahead and kick this list off with a personal favorite of mine that came out way back in 2001 on the Game Boy Advance, and that would be F-Zero Maximum Velocity. So F-Zero has been a personal favorite for me ever since I first played it back in 1990. The original is still incredibly fun to play, and it's hard to believe that Nintendo knocked it out of the park that hard with a single-player only futuristic racing game. But F-Zero was so texturally interesting as an arcade racer, you could have a blast playing solo or passing off with a friend. And that's how I spent most of my time enjoying the original, passing off with friends who would come over to my house, or with my dad who always favored Captain Falcon, while I personally always raced as Samurai Goro in the Fire Stingray. Mostly because if I'm remembering right, he had a top speed of something like 480 kilometers per hour. Slow to get there, but I always loved that he had the top speed in the game. So anyways, yeah, I have a lot of built-in fondness for it as a series, and I've been playing F-Zero games in one form or another for decades at this point. And F-Zero Maximum Velocity has been a particular favorite for me ever since I first got to play F-Zero on a backlit Game Boy Advance SP. I mean, it was good on the original Game Boy Advance, but when I finally upgraded to the SP, it completely blew my mind being able to take console classics like this on the go on a screen you could actually see in the dark. But now you can enjoy Game Boy games on all sorts of screens, and the Steam Deck is a great handheld for running GBA games, but this one in particular is also well suited to the deck, not just because of the increased screen real estate, but the deck is a whole lot more comfortable for this game specifically than the Game Boy Advance SP was, or the Analog Pocket is, mostly because of how much you need to lean on the shoulder buttons to drift around corners. And F-Zero as an arcade racing experience really stands the test of time because it's as white-knuckle now as it was in the original release on the SNES. There just weren't a lot of racers at the time that asked you to consider explosive track hazards as a possibility, and F-Zero works because you're not just racing, but also managing your ride's health and making moment-to-moment judgment calls of whether to burn a boost immediately, or to hold on to it anticipating it's getting you out of a jam on a subsequent lap. And you'll perform all of this while blasting through 22 different tracks at speeds nearing 300 miles per hour, where a wrong move can send you flying off the track or cause you to ping-pong so hard in some sharp narrow turn that explosion on track is a very real possibility. If you've played F-Zero before, you probably already know what to expect, but Maximum Velocity did have some notable features, again including 22 tracks, 4 cups, and 10 new pilots and machines. I will say it's a little bit more slippery than the original, and it definitely took some time for me to get the rhythm down again after having not touched it for a number of years, but once it clicks, it feels great, and as a racing game with a pretty linear progression path, it's well suited to pick up in play sessions. Next up is a game I barely knew existed and had written it off essentially on principle as a movie tie-in game when it came out in 2011, and that would be Thor: God of Thunder for the Nintendo DS. And I'm sorry to say this, but historically, and maybe unfairly, if a game is based on a movie or a TV show, it's usually a pretty safe assumption that you're going to be in for a mediocre time at best, or a straight up bad time at worst. It's a cliche, sure, but one that has more often than not been a fairly safe bet when it comes to video games. But every now and then a movie game does escape the trappings of shameless cash-in territory and bring something legitimately fun to the table. And Thor for the Nintendo DS does exactly that, mostly because it's by WayForward Games, who have brought us a variety of fun side-scrolling adventures from Shantae to River City Girls to the criminally underrated Mummy Demastered. The setup is that Asgard gets invaded by trolls, and Thor predictably and hot-headedly sets out to deal with the problem. Along the way you'll see a lot of familiar faces from Odin to Loki and the Warriors 3, although a lot of the presentation and setup looks closer to the comics than it does the actual Thor movie. And I'd say the setup is perfectly fine, but what really grabbed me was the gameplay, which takes great advantage of the DS's verticality, which, considering I'm playing it on the Steam Deck, does lose a bit of its charm in the translation to a widescreen platform, but it's still pretty fun. At its core, Thor is a beat-em-up, but one with some really fun mechanics to mess around with, and all of them feel perfectly aligned with Thor as a character. You can use Thor's hammer to fly straight up into the air if you'd like, and then crash back down with an AoE attack. You can chuck Mjolnir at enemies from a distance, pick up and throw even beefy enemies in the environment, and just generally get as close to feeling like Thor as you can on a 2D plane. Now granted, this is a fairly linear adventure that could be knocked out in about 3 or 4 hours, but it's nice that WayForward works so hard to capture the essence of the character and make its fantastical elements pop on screen. There's also more depth than your average side-scrolling beat-em-up thanks to equipable runes that you can find which alter Thor's abilities in ways like making him faster or adding a concussion effect that blasts out every time you hurl Mjolnir at an enemy. When it comes to the enemies, they're mostly varied enough, although it does start to feel a tad repetitive. Thankfully, it always seemed to lock it up just shy of overstaying its welcome with some towering boss fights, which I definitely appreciated. And the presentation is solid on nearly all fronts. Environments look lush and colorful, and the sprite work is predictably top-notch. Is it the best beat-em-up I've ever played? No, it's not, but I do think it lands firmly in Hidden Gem territory, and is fun enough for what it is. Plus, it's commendable that WayForward took the time to try and make a compelling MCU game years before we'd be treated to bangers like Spider-Man or Guardians of the Galaxy. So if you're a beat-em-up fan, this is probably a great way to kill a few hours, or if you just want to have a little bit of lightweight fun while you're waiting for the next Marvel movie to start. Next up, moving on to another 2D game, but one that's decidedly less violent and way more chill, if not sickeningly adorable, would be Loco Roco for the PSP. In Loco Roco, you control a bunch of, well, Loco Roco on a peaceful faraway planet with their friends, the Mui Mui. All is well until one day they get invaded by the Mojo Troop, and that's where you come in, by manipulating the world's gravity to help them deal with the problem. The premise is mostly an adorable vehicle for explaining why you keep jostling around a bunch of little gelatinous blobs to guide them through a bunch of colorful stages. And honestly, it's a fascinating setup. Apparently the creator, Tsutomu Kouno, had the idea while on a train, and he used a PDA to sketch out a game that would involve multiple similar characters on screen, but that they would not be directly controlled by the player. Since the PSP was just on the horizon, he reckoned its shoulder buttons would be well suited to the game, and in turn it was released for Sony's debut gaming handheld back in 2006, which is when I first played it. It was adorable then, and it has lost exactly none of its charm in the modern age. Most of the time to control the on-screen action, you'll be interacting with the shoulder buttons, right bumper to tilt right, left bumper to tilt left, and then hold them both together to make your Loco Roco jump. Beyond that, you can also hold a button to split your Loco Roco to a bunch of little Loco Rocos to pass through a variety of different obstacles or reduce their weight so that they can be whisked away on the wind. You can sort of attack enemies occasionally by bouncing into them, but most of the fun comes from navigating the levels that aren't just colorful, but also filled with extremely well-hidden secrets. All this is to say, while it's a straightforward game mechanically speaking, the creative ways they use this small number of mechanics is a whole lot of fun. And it's all held together by physics that are just incredibly satisfying to interact with. Not to mention, in addition to some head-scratching platforming challenges, it also eases off periodically with little breaks for your Loco Roco to sing for a little bit, which usually causes something interesting in the environment to happen. That's fun and useful. I really can't say enough good things about this game. I loved it when I originally played it on the PSP in its early days, and I love it now nearly 2 decades later. Because honestly, it kinda reminds me of Pac-Man in that it also illustrates how fun gameplay more than anything else is what lets games stand the test of time. And it also doesn't hurt that the graphics are gorgeous, of course. Actually, speaking of which, quick side note, you can definitely increase the render resolution of the PSP emulator to play these games at a much sharper clarity for modern screens. I mean, assuming you like that. If you want it looking crispy, then by all means leave it as is, but I did want to point out that if you want, you can smooth things out a bit in the emulator. Overall, if you're a fan of relaxing games or platformers that don't necessarily have you running around at supersonic speeds, Loco Roco is great. It was a chill game way before chill games were so popular, and I can't recommend it enough. Now next up is a game that I've had multiple people recommend to me before, but I gotta tell you, I'm pretty conflicted about it, and that would be PNO3. PNO3 is one of those games that has always lived on the periphery of my gaming memory. It was a GameCube exclusive, and I know I've seen this box art dozens of times through the years. And my brain would always zero in on the fact that it was a Capcom game, and Capcom's one of the very few publishers that's been in my good graces ever since I was a kid. But I always hesitated, and having now played it, I can say with confidence I was definitely right, because PNO3 is a really weird game. And just to be clear, I love weird games, but this one was so jarring to me, I'm not quite sure how I feel about it yet. Now the premise isn't weird necessarily, it seems like pretty straightforward sci-fi mercenary stuff, at least in the early stages. But what's bizarre is it's a third-person shooter where you can't move and shoot at the same time. And as someone who's played fast, fluid third-person shooters for years, I don't know that I've ever played a game that felt this alien and weird to me. It feels more like DDR than a shooter because while you're planted in place firing away, you respond to incoming projectiles by dodging with a button press. And when you are moving, it feels like you can only move forward in this very narrow cone of lateral movement. Thankfully, they do provide a quick turnaround button a la Resident Evil, which does make sense now that I think about it, considering this is a Shinji Mikami game. But yeah, suffice it to say, if you're an action game veteran jumping in for the first time, it's gonna feel pretty stiff. But that awkwardness randomness aside, I do like the arcadey room-clearing structure of PNO3, and honestly, despite the awkward adjustment period, I still think I want to stick with this one. I mean, there are other shooters that have really weird movement and control schemes too, like Killer 7, so maybe this one will just grow on me after I've had a little bit more time with it. On the visuals front, I really do like the clean sci-fi aesthetic. It might look a little bland compared to most other sci-fi action games that I've played, but I mean, it's not offensive or anything, just sort of minimalist, I guess, and I can appreciate that every bit as much as I can something louder like, say, Bulletstorm. But yeah, overall I'm just not quite sure how I feel about it yet. Definitely going to spend some more time with it, but yeah, if you have any experience with this game, please do shout me out in the comments because I would love to hear your thoughts as well. In sharp contrast to PNO3, this next game has super fluid movement, and is a game that I overlooked for years, and that would be Zone of the Enders. Zone of the Enders is a game I remember my friends really enjoying, and I thought it sounded cool piloting a mech and doing some rock'em sock'em robots, but for whatever reason I just never got around to it. Which is especially weird because I do have a physical copy of Zone of the Enders HD collection for the PS3, and in the course of making this video I was surprised to find that I actually have a digital copy of this for the Xbox, which apparently dropped free in Games with Gold back in September 2021. So in a nutshell, I've just been doing a really bad job of finally playing Zone of the Enders until now. Taking place in 2172, mankind has colonized the moons of Earth, Jupiter, and Mars. And the adventure kicks off with a military force that invades the Jupiter colony of Antilla to try and secure 2 orbital frames. But then a young boy named Leo flees to a hangar and finds one of these orbital frames, and before you know it, you're smack in the middle of a sci-fi adventure and helping the United Nations by bringing that orbital frame back to safety. As a story, I really like what I've seen so far, but as a Kojima game, probably not too surprising since I've enjoyed most of his other work, but I wasn't sure if I'd love the gameplay here. The truth is, I haven't played a ton of mech games, and one that I remember most fondly was Battle Clash for the Super Nintendo, which was decades ago at this point. So I was a little concerned that it wouldn't quite resonate with me, but I was completely wrong, and even if it feels a little bit slow by today's standards, I really got into it and enjoyed squaring off with other frames and larger bosses in my time with it so far. Something else I thought was neat was its apparent open-ended mission structure. I say apparently because I'm not sure yet if I take on some of the optional quests as I fly above the colony if those will lock off other paths or not. But the fact that this is more than just an action game and really is trying to establish a really fun narrative while also providing some degree of player choice in terms of how that adventure plays out is definitely appealing to me. As a blatant gaffe in my desire to play all of Kojima's games at some point, I'll probably go ahead and see this one through, although I may switch over to the HD collection at some point. Now if you're looking for a more torturous take on the genre and are a fan of games like Armored Core, I'm not sure if this would really fit the bill for you, but if you're looking for a more arcadey take on that genre, I'd say this version is definitely still worth checking out, assuming you don't already have access to the HD collection. Alright, and that's it for this one. Obviously doing a list of video games is nothing new for me here on the channel, but it was kind of neat to explore a new format and try that out with specifically emulated games from classic retro systems that I personally love and enjoy. So, you know, if you have any game recommendations that you would throw out there, be they emulated or just natively on the Steam Deck, I would love to hear about them. Please let me know in the comments below. As far as what's coming down the pike for the channel, I do have April pickups coming later this week, and then next week I think I'm going to be talking about games that are coming out in May for PC, and also I think probably another emulation video, maybe compare and contrast the Steam Deck with a more dedicated emulation device. That might be some fun to explore, but we'll see. I've got a few ideas kicking around at this point. But yeah, as always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel. I really, really appreciate it. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.